The prison gates slammed shut with a sound that felt like a warning. A new inmate stepped inside, quiet, thin, and dressed in worn-out clothes that looked like they'd survived too many winters. In his hands was a small plastic bag, 2 letters, a prayer book, and a pair of cheap slippers. He didn't look tough. He didn't look dangerous. He looked poor. The hallway was lined with hardened criminals, men who smelled weakness like blood in water. They stared at him as he walked past, some laughing, some whispering, some already imagining what they'd take from him. And then the whispers stopped, because one man stood up. Bruno, the boss, Kane. The feared prison king. The guy who decided who ate, who slept, who got protected, and who got crushed. His gang moved with him like shadows, and every step he took made the whole block feel smaller. Bruno approached the newcomer slowly, smiling like he'd just found entertainment. "Well, well," he said. "What do we have here?" "A little lost puppy." The newcomer stayed calm, eyes forward. Bruno leaned closer, scanning him from head to toe like trash. "Name?" The newcomer finally spoke, voice low and steady. "Steven." Bruno laughed. "Steven what?" "Seagull." The moment that name left his mouth, Bruno burst out laughing even louder, like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. "Seagull." Bruno mocked. "What are you, some kind of action hero?" His gang laughed with him. The whole hallway echoed with cruelty. Then Bruno slapped Steven's bag right out of his hands. The letters scattered across the floor. Steven bent down and picked them up calmly, one by one, as if none of it mattered. That calm irritated Bruno. So Bruno shoved him hard into the wall. But Steven didn't fall. Didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. He just turned his head slowly, his eyes cold, controlled, unreadable. In prison, bullies don't attack strength first. They attack silence, because silence looks like weakness. But sometimes silence isn't fear. Sometimes it's discipline. Bruno smirked. "Listen, poor boy, you're gonna learn how this place works." Steven stood straight and said quietly, "I already know." Bruno's smile faded, because something about Steven's voice felt dangerous. Have you ever seen someone get bullied just because they looked weak? Comment yes or no below. Steven was escorted deeper into the prison, past rusted metal doors and long corridors filled with shouting voices. The air smelled like sweat, cigarettes, and anger, like every breath carried someone's past violence with it. He didn't look around too much. Not because he was scared, but because he didn't want to give anyone a reason. The guard pushed him forward. "Cell block C, move." Steven walked calmly, holding his thin blanket and plastic bag. In the corner of his eye, he noticed men watching him from behind bars, whispering things that sounded like jokes but carried sharp intentions. "That one's gonna fold," someone said. "Looks like a charity case," another laughed. "Boss Bruno's gonna eat him alive." Steven heard it all. But his face remained empty, no reaction, no emotion. That's what made them uncomfortable. Because in prison, fear is normal. Anger is normal. Panic is normal. Calmness is not. Bruno followed behind with his gang, smiling like a man who already owned Steven's future. "You see, Steven," Bruno said loudly so everyone could hear, "this place ain't about rules. It's about respect." He paused, then grinned. "And you don't look like you deserve any." Steven stopped walking and turned slightly. "I'm not here for trouble." Bruno stepped closer, his face inches away. "Wrong answer. Trouble is here for you." He snapped his fingers. One of Bruno's men, huge, tattooed arms, dead eyes, walked forward and shoved Steven's shoulder hard. Steven stumbled one step, and then steadied himself. The enforcer smirked. "That's right. Learn your place." Steven didn't fight back. He didn't raise his hands. He simply continued walking. But the gang didn't stop. They bumped him again. They mocked his shoes. They made jokes about his cheap clothes. They wanted him to explode, because if he exploded, they could justify destroying him. Explanation: this is how prison predators work. They don't start with punches. They start with humiliation. They test your pride first, because pride makes men make mistakes. Stephen reached his cell. It was small, dark, and already occupied. A skinny inmate sat in the corner with bruises on his cheekbone, eyes hollow like he'd already given up. He looked up at Stephen and whispered, "You're new, aren't you?" Stephen nodded. "Yeah." The inmate glanced out the bars nervously. "Then listen, if Bruno is watching you, you're already in trouble." Stephen placed his bag down slowly. "Why?" The inmate swallowed. "Because Bruno chooses one new guy every month. He breaks him publicly, to remind everyone who owns this place." Stephen didn't answer. He just sat quietly on the lower bunk. A few seconds later, footsteps approached. Heavy ones. Bruno's top enforcer returned, this time holding a dirty mop and a bucket. He tossed them onto Stephen's bed like trash. "Boss says you clean the toilets tonight." Stephen stared at the mop. "I'm not your worker." The enforcer laughed. "You are whatever Bruno says you are." Stephen stood up slowly. Not aggressively. Not emotionally. Just controlled. And for a moment, the cell felt colder. The enforcer tilted his head. "What, you got something to say?" Stephen's voice stayed calm, but it carried weight. "You're making a mistake." The enforcer stepped closer with a grin. "Old man, you look broke. You look weak. You look like you'll cry if I slap you." He slapped Stephen's chest lightly, mocking, testing. Stephen didn't move. That was the problem. Because bullies hate two things: confidence and silence. The enforcer shoved him harder. Stephen still didn't react. The skinny inmate in the corner whispered, "Please, don't do it. They'll kill you." Stephen looked at him and said quietly, "They won't." The enforcer laughed again. "Oh, you think you're special?" Stephen leaned closer and whispered something only the enforcer could hear. "I've faced worse men than you, in places darker than this." The enforcer's smile twitched for a second. He couldn't explain it, but something about Stephen's eyes felt trained. Not scared. Not angry. Trained. But pride wouldn't let him back off. He pointed at Stephen and said, "Tonight, you sleep on the floor. Tomorrow, Bruno comes to teach you respect." Stephen nodded once. "Fine." Then he looked away and quietly added, "But when he comes, make sure the whole block is watching." If you were in Stephen's place, would you stay calm or strike back immediately? Comment calm or fight. The next morning, Stephen Seagal woke up before the noise. Before the shouting. Before the metal doors slammed. Before the prison came alive like a beast. He sat on the cold floor where he had slept all night, his blanket folded neatly beside him. His back didn't ache the way it would for most men his age. His breathing was steady. "Come." The skinny inmate in the corner stared at him like Stephen was a ghost. "You didn't move all night," the inmate whispered. Stephen stood up slowly. "No reason to." The inmate looked confused, then nervous. "Bruno's coming today." Stephen nodded once, like he already knew. And that's what made the inmate even more afraid. Because fear was the normal language here, fear or aggression. Stephen spoke neither. A guard opened the bars. "Cafeteria." The moment Stephen stepped into the hallway, he could feel eyes following him. Prison had its own kind of radar. They could sense something was coming. Stephen walked with his tray lying quietly, like any other inmate. Around him, men talked loudly, laughed crudely, or stared with predator focus. And sitting at the center table like a king was Bruno Kane. Bruno didn't eat like the others. He didn't sit like the others. His plate was full, his chair untouched by anyone else, and his gang stood behind him like bodyguards. That's when Stephen understood something important. Bruno wasn't just feared. He was obeyed. As Stephen moved forward, Bruno's eyes locked onto him, slow and deliberate. Then Bruno smiled. He stretched one leg out under the table. A simple move. Almost invisible. Stephen's foot hit Bruno's leg and his tray tilted. Food splashed. A cup of juice spilled down his shirt. A loud laugh exploded across the cafeteria. Stephen didn't swear. He didn't panic. He simply placed the tray down. Then he wiped his shirt with the same calmness a man would use to clean dust off his shoulder. That calmness irritated Bruno like gasoline on fire. Bruno stood up. Slowly. Like a showman building suspense. "Everybody look!" Bruno shouted. "Our new fish is trying to act tough." The whole cafeteria turned into a theater. Every inmate wanted entertainment. And the best entertainment in prison was humiliation. Bruno walked up and slapped Stephen's shoulder lightly, mocking. "Ah, you okay, poor boy?" Bruno said in a fake sweet voice. "You want me to bring you a towel too?" Stephen looked at him. "Move." The word landed hard. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just firm. The cafeteria went quieter. Bruno's smile froze for half a second. Then he laughed again, louder, trying to reclaim control. "Oh." He said move. Bruno shouted to the crowd. "You hear that? The poor man has a voice." His gang laughed like hyenas. Then Bruno suddenly shoved Stephen's chest. Hard. Stephen stepped back once. Still didn't raise his fists. Still didn't explode. Bruno leaned close, his breath hot, eyes cold. "Let me teach you the first rule of prison," Bruno whispered. "You don't tell me what to do." Stephen stared back. "Come." "The first rule of life," Stephen replied quietly, "is you don't touch people without consequences." A few inmates exchanged looks. One man whispered, "Yo, this dude ain't normal." Explanation. In prison, a boss can't lose face. If he does, his whole power system collapses. That's why Bruno wasn't just bullying Stephen. He was performing dominance for the entire block. If Stephen resisted and stood strong, the prison would start asking questions Bruno didn't want asked. Bruno's jaw tightened. He couldn't allow this. So he turned the humiliation into an announcement. Bruno raised his voice. "Steven Seagal," he said like it was a joke. "You got a problem with me?" Stephen didn't answer. Bruno turned to the crowd. "Today in the yard, we're gonna see if this Steven Seagal is real or just another broken man pretending." The crowd erupted. The yard meant one thing: violence. Stephen looked around and saw guards pretending not to hear. Not caring. That's when he understood another truth. This prison didn't run on justice. It ran on fear. Back in the cell block, the skinny inmate looked terrified. "You're dead," he whispered. "Nobody survives a yard circle with Bruno." Stephen sat down calmly. "Then don't watch." The inmate shook his head. "You don't get it. Bruno doesn't just fight. He humiliates. He breaks bones and makes you beg. That's how he stays boss." Stephen looked at the bruised inmate's face. "How long have you been here?" Stephen asked. 2 years. Stephen nodded slowly. "How many times has Bruno hurt you?" The inmate's eyes filled with anger and shame. "Too many." Stephen's gaze sharpened. "That ends today," Stephen said. The inmate blinked. "What?" Stephen didn't respond. Instead, he stood up and walked toward the cell bars. Because he knew the next part wasn't about him anymore. It was about everyone Bruno had crushed. A few hours later, yard time arrived. The prison yard was loud. Wide. Open. A perfect stage. Bruno stood waiting, shirt sleeves rolled up, hands taped, gang gathered like an audience. Inmates formed a large circle. Even people who hated Bruno still came to watch, because this wasn't just a fight. This was an event. Stephen walked in quietly. No swagger. No drama. Just calm footsteps and controlled breathing. The circle tightened. Someone shouted, "Kill him, Bruno." Someone else yelled, "This dude's gonna fold." Bruno stepped forward with a grin. "So, Stephen, you ready to learn respect?" Stephen looked at him. "Respect is earned, not forced." Bruno laughed. "I'll earn yours right now." He snapped his fingers. 2 of his enforcers stepped into the circle. Big men. Tattooed. Angry. Bruno smirked. "Before I touch you, my boys are gonna soften you up." The crowd cheered. Stephen's eyes didn't change. He exhaled slowly, and for the first time, he shifted his stance. Not wide like a street fighter. Not wild like a brawler. Balanced. Centered. Like a man who had done this 1,000 times. The skinny inmate watching from far away whispered in shock. That stance. One of Bruno's men rushed Stephen. A heavy punch. Stephen moved. One step sideways. A calm block. Then a quick wrist grab. A twist. The attacker dropped to his knees with a scream. The yard went quiet. The second attacker charged. Stephen didn't panic. He pivoted, swept the leg, and the man crashed down like a tree cut at the base. 2 men down. In less than 5 seconds. No excessive violence. No show-off. Just efficiency. Bruno's smile vanished. The crowd's energy changed, from entertainment to fear. Because now, they weren't watching a weak newcomer. They were watching a trained predator. A real martial artist doesn't fight to prove ego. He fights to end danger quickly. That's why Stephen's movements looked almost unfair, because he wasn't reacting with anger. He was reacting with skill. Bruno stepped forward, eyes wide, voice shaky. What are you? Stephen stared at him. And then he said the coldest line possible. You should have left me alone. At this moment, should Stephen finish Bruno, or teach him a lesson without destroying him? Comment finish him or teach him. The prison yard went unnaturally quiet. 2 of Bruno's strongest enforcers lay on the ground, groaning in pain, one clutching his wrist, the other struggling to breathe. The inmates who were cheering just seconds ago now stared like they'd witnessed something impossible. Bruno stood frozen. His jaw was tight, but his eyes had changed. For the first time, the prison boss didn't look like a king. He looked like a man who had just realized his crown might be taken. Bruno tried to laugh it off. Nice tricks, he said loudly, forcing arrogance back into his voice. You got lucky. Stephen didn't respond. He simply stood there in that calm stance, his breathing steady, his gaze fixed on Bruno like a judge. That silence made the crowd uneasy. Because bullies thrive on reaction. And Stephen gave none. Bruno stepped forward, circling him like a predator trying to find a weak spot. But Stephen didn't follow him with panic. He followed him with awareness. Every small movement Stephen made was controlled, like he could measure danger without emotion. A few inmates started whispering. Yo, who fights like that? That wasn't street fighting. That looked trained. At the edge of the yard, an old prisoner sitting on a bench slowly stood up. He was called Mr. Carter, a man who had been inside longer than most guards had been alive. People didn't mess with him. Not because he was strong, but because he had seen everything. He leaned forward, squinting at Stephen. His expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief. No, he whispered. He took a step closer. Those movements, he muttered. That's not prison style. That's martial discipline. Stephen glanced at him for a moment, and gave the smallest nod, almost invisible. Mr. Carter's eyes widened like he'd just seen a ghost. He whispered again, this time louder. That can't be. Bruno heard the whispering and snapped. What are you all looking at? He barked. He's just a poor nobody. But the crowd wasn't convinced anymore. Because in prison, strength isn't just about muscles. It's about presence. And Stephen's presence was starting to feel dangerous. Explanation. In places like prison, people become experts at reading fear. They know when someone is bluffing. They know when someone is weak. But they also know when a man has lived violence before, real violence. And Stephen's calm wasn't normal calm. It was the calm of someone who had trained his body and mind for years. Bruno's ego couldn't handle it. So he did what bosses always do when they sense their power slipping. He escalated. Bruno raised his voice again to pull the spotlight back onto himself. Everybody listen, he shouted. You want to know what happens when someone embarrasses me? He pointed at Stephen. This man thinks he can step into my prison and make me look weak. He walked closer and shoved Stephen's shoulder again. Stephen didn't move. Bruno shoved harder. Stephen still didn't move. That only made Bruno angrier. "You hear me, Stephen?" Bruno roared. "This prison belongs to me." Stephen finally spoke, voice calm but sharp. "No," he said. "It belongs to fear. And fear ends when people stop feeding it." That line hit the yard like lightning. Some inmates blinked like they weren't used to hearing truth. Bruno's face turned red. "You talk too much," Bruno spat. He turned and signaled to his gang. 4 men stepped forward. Not normal inmates. These were Bruno's personal attackers, the ones he used when he wanted someone to disappear quietly. They entered the circle like wolves, cracking their knuckles, smiling with cruelty. Bruno grinned again, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's see if your little karate works against 4 men." The crowd murmured nervously. Even the guards at the fence started paying attention. Stephen looked at the 4 men. Then at Bruno. Then he exhaled slowly. That exhale wasn't fear. It was preparation. Mr. Carter shouted from the side. "Bruno! Don't do it!" Bruno turned sharply. "Shut up, old man." But Carter didn't stop. His voice shook, not from fear, but from urgency. "You don't know who that is." Bruno laughed, mocking him. "Oh yeah. Then tell us, Carter." Bruno shouted. "Who is he?" "The president." Carter hesitated. He looked at Stephen. Stephen's eyes warned him, "Not yet." Carter swallowed hard and said instead, "He's not what you think." Bruno rolled his eyes. Then he screamed, "Attack!" The 4 men rushed Stephen at the same time. 2 from the front. 1 from behind. 1 from the side. The crowd expected Stephen to get overwhelmed. But Stephen moved like water. He stepped left. 1 attacker missed. He grabbed the second man's wrist, twisted it, and used his momentum to slam him into the 3rd attacker. The 4th attacker swung wildly. Stephen ducked, swept the leg, and the man crashed down. In seconds, chaos turned into silence. Bodies hit the ground. The yard exploded. Not with cheers. With shock. Because Stephen wasn't fighting like a prisoner. He was fighting like a legend. Stephen didn't keep hitting them. He didn't stomp them. He didn't humiliate them. He simply ended the danger, then stepped back. Bruno stumbled backward, his confidence draining. His voice cracked. "What are you?" he shouted. Stephen walked closer. Slow steps. Dangerous calm. "I'm someone you should have respected," Stephen said. Bruno tried to save his pride. He raised his fists, shaking. "You think you're special. You think I'm scared of you." Stephen stopped, looked him dead in the eyes, and said, "You're not scared of me, you're scared of losing control." Bruno's mouth opened, but no words came out. The inmates' whispers grew louder again. "That's not normal. That's Steven Seagal, isn't it?" "No way, the legend." Carter lowered his head in disbelief. Because he knew. He had seen Stephen's old martial arts videos on prison TVs years ago, when men watched fighters the way they watched gods. And now, that fighter was standing right here in the dirt. Do you think Bruno should still fight Stephen 1v1, or should he surrender before it's too late? Comment fight or surrender. Bruno Kane's hands were shaking. Not because he was weak, but because his brain was struggling to accept what his eyes had just seen. 4 of his best men were down. Not crawling away. Not pretending. Down. And the worst part, Steven Seagal wasn't even breathing hard. He stood in the center of the yard like a storm that hadn't fully arrived yet, calm on the surface, deadly underneath. The circle of inmates tightened. Some were excited. Some were terrified. Some were whispering the same question again and again. Who is this guy? Bruno tried to reclaim his image. He laughed loudly, forcing confidence back into his voice. You think you won, huh? You think you're tough? Stephen didn't answer. He just stared at Bruno, quiet and controlled. That silence felt heavier than a threat. Bruno stepped closer, pointing at Stephen's chest. You embarrassed me in front of my prison, Bruno hissed. Now I'm going to break you in front of everyone." Stephen's eyes didn't change. "You already broke enough people," Stephen replied. "Today it ends." That line made the yard shift. Because inmates weren't used to hearing someone talk to Bruno like that. They weren't used to someone speaking truth without begging for survival. Bruno's face turned red. He ripped off his shirt dramatically, throwing it on the ground like he was a gladiator preparing for war. "Fine," he shouted. "No more boys. No more games." He raised his fists and roared, "Me and you." The crowd erupted. A 1v1 fight in the yard wasn't just violence, it was status. It was power. It was a declaration of who the prison should fear. Stephen looked at Bruno. Then he said calmly, "Don't do this." Bruno laughed, almost crazy. "Don't do this," he screamed. "You think you can talk me out of it?" Stephen shook his head slightly. "No." He stepped into position. "I'm giving you one last chance to walk away." The yard went silent. Even the guards watched now. Bruno stared like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then he smiled like a demon. "Oh, you just made this sweeter." He suddenly charged. Bruno was big, built like a wrecking ball. His punches were heavy and wild, the kind of punches that end fights in one hit. The first punch came fast. A hook meant to snap Stephen's jaw. But Stephen moved like he was already in the future. He leaned back slightly, just enough for the punch to miss by inches. Bruno swung again. Stephen stepped sideways. "Miss." Bruno swung again. Stephen ducked and shifted. "Miss." 3 big punches. 3 misses. The inmates began murmuring. "Yo, he can't touch him. That's crazy. He's moving like water." Bruno grew angrier with every miss. He threw a 4th punch, stronger, desperate, violent. Stephen caught it. Not with struggle. With precision. His hand locked Bruno's wrist. His other hand pressed against Bruno's elbow. Then Stephen twisted. A sharp crack echoed. Bruno screamed. The yard froze. But Stephen didn't stop. He stepped in and delivered a shoulder strike into Bruno's chest. Short, controlled, devastating. Bruno flew backward and crashed into the dirt. The crowd exploded. "Oh my God! Bruno's down. He dropped him." Bruno sat up coughing, eyes wide like he'd been hit by something supernatural. Stephen didn't rush him. He didn't celebrate. He simply stood there, breathing slow. A street fighter fights with rage. But a real martial artist fights with timing. Timing beats strength, because strength is predictable, and timing is impossible to read. Bruno stood up again, angry tears in his eyes. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." He rushed again like a bull. This time Bruno aimed lower, trying to tackle Stephen to the ground. A dirty move. But Stephen anticipated it. He stepped aside, grabbed Bruno's arm, and used his own momentum against him, spinning him with a smooth throw. Bruno slammed to the ground again. Dust rose. The yard was silent. Stephen walked toward him slowly. Bruno tried to crawl back, shocked. What are you?" Bruno gasped. Stephen leaned down. "You're used to hurting people who can't fight back," Stephen said. "That's why you feel powerful." Bruno spat dirt and tried to stand again. Stephen stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. One touch. And Bruno froze. Because he felt something terrifying. Stephen wasn't trying hard. Stephen was holding back. Bruno's voice cracked. You could have killed me." Stephen nodded. "Yes." Then he whispered the coldest truth. "But I'm not like you." Bruno's lips trembled. His whole body shook. The inmates began whispering louder. "That's him. That's Steven Seagal. The legend." Bruno looked around and realized something worse than pain. He realized he was losing respect. And in prison, losing respect was worse than losing a fight. Bruno fell to his knees. His voice dropped to a desperate whisper. "Please." Stephen stared down at him. "No one ever begged you before," Stephen said. "So you don't know how disgusting it feels, until it's you." Bruno's eyes filled with terror. Stephen turned away slightly, addressing the yard. Power doesn't mean you hurt people. He paused. It means you protect them. Bruno broke. He bowed his head like a defeated king. Should Stephen forgive Bruno, or should Bruno face the same humiliation he gave others? Comment forgive or no mercy. Bruno Kane stayed on his knees, breathing like a broken animal. The dirt stuck to his skin. His pride, once untouchable, was now scattered in front of hundreds of eyes. The same inmates who used to fear him were now watching him like he was nothing. And standing over him, calm as ever, Steven Seagal. Stephen didn't raise a fist. He didn't insult him. He didn't celebrate. He simply stood there, like he'd already won before the fight even started. Bruno looked up slowly, his voice shaking. "Who are you?" he whispered again, like he hoped the answer would change reality. Stephen stared back. "I'm the man you should have respected," he replied. The yard remained silent, until loud footsteps approached from the gate. Not normal guard footsteps. These were organized, urgent, authoritative. The crowd turned. A group of guards entered quickly, pushing through the circle. And at the front of them was a man none of the inmates dared to laugh at. Deputy Warden Harris. The senior officer. A guy who didn't just control the yard, he controlled the prison. Even Bruno's gang stepped back instantly. Harris scanned the scene and stopped. His eyes landed on Bruno on the ground. Then on the injured attackers. Then on Stephen. At first, Harris looked confused. Then his expression changed, sharply. He stared at Stephen like he was staring at a memory he couldn't believe had become real. He took one step closer. Then another. The entire yard held its breath. Harris swallowed hard. And then, in a voice that sounded almost shocked, he said, "Sir." Stephen didn't respond. Harris continued, voice lower now, respectful. "Steven Seagal." The moment that name was said out loud by someone important, the yard exploded. Inmates started shouting, "No W.Y. That's him. Steven Seagal. The legend. Brew, that's crazy." Even guards were whispering. Bruno froze. His face turned pale, like the blood had left it completely. His lips trembled. "No," Bruno stuttered. "That's not possible." Deputy Warden Harris glanced at Bruno like he was dirt. "You put your hands on him?" Harris asked, voice deadly calm. Bruno couldn't speak. The crowd kept murmuring louder. Some inmates were now looking at Bruno with disgust. Because suddenly, this wasn't just a prison fight. This was a world legend being attacked for entertainment. Stephen finally spoke calmly, addressing Harris. "I didn't start it," Stephen said. Harris nodded slowly. "I believe you." Bruno's eyes widened. He had never heard Harris speak like that to anyone. Not even Bruno. Harris turned to the guards. "Get the medical team," he ordered. "And separate Bruno's men." The guards moved fast. Bruno suddenly panicked. He crawled forward on his knees, reaching towards Stephen like a desperate child. "Wait. Wait." Bruno shouted. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Stephen looked down at him with cold calm. "Not knowing isn't your excuse," Stephen said. Bruno's voice cracked. Tears formed. "I thought you were weak. I thought you were nobody." Stephen's eyes sharpened. "That's the problem," Stephen said quietly. "You only respect people you think are strong." The words hit harder than any punch. Bullies don't bully because they're powerful. They bully because they're afraid. Afraid of being seen as small. Afraid of losing control. That's why they attack the quiet ones. They think quiet means weak. But Stephen's quiet wasn't weakness. It was mastery. Bruno collapsed forward, shaking. "I'll do anything," he begged. "Please, don't let them ruin me." Stephen didn't flinch. "No one cared when you ruined others," Stephen replied. Bruno's face twisted with regret. He looked around at the crowd. Men he once terrorized now stared at him like he was a joke. Even his own gang didn't step forward. They stayed back. Because bullies are only followed when they look unbeatable. And Bruno didn't look unbeatable anymore. He looked exposed. Deputy Warden Harris stepped in closer. "Bruno Kane," Harris said coldly. "You're done." Bruno snapped his head up. "No. Please," he screamed. "Harris, listen, please." Harris leaned down and whispered so only Bruno could hear. "You made this yard a war zone for years. Today, the war ends." Bruno's eyes filled with terror. 2 guards grabbed his arms. Bruno fought for 1 second, then realized it was useless. He turned back to Stephen, voice trembling. I'm sorry. Please." Stephen looked at him. Long. Quiet. Then he said something that shocked everyone. "I'm not here to destroy you." Bruno froze. Stephen continued. "I'm here to end what you've been doing." Bruno choked. How can you say that after what I did?" Stephen stepped closer and crouched slightly to Bruno's level. "Because revenge is easy," Stephen said. "Discipline is harder." Bruno cried now, real tears. "I bullied people because it made me feel safe." Stephen nodded slowly. "That's what weak men do," Stephen said. "They create fear, so they don't have to face their own." Bruno looked up like he couldn't breathe. Stephen stood straight again and addressed Harris. "This prison needs order," Stephen said calmly. "Not fear." Harris nodded with respect. "It will have it." Bruno was dragged away, still begging, still shaking, still broken. And as he passed the circle of inmates, no one cheered for him. No one feared him. They just watched. Silent. Because the prison had just witnessed something powerful. A bully didn't just lose a fight. He lost his identity. Stephen remained in the yard alone for a moment. The inmates stared at him now differently. Not as a victim. Not as a newcomer. But as something else. A legend who didn't need to prove anything. If you were Steven Seagal, would you forgive Bruno after seeing real regret? Comment forgive or punish. By the next morning, the prison felt different. Not quieter. Prisons never truly become quiet. But different in a deeper way. The air no longer belonged to Bruno Kane. 4 years, Bruno's name controlled cell block C like a curse. Men whispered it with fear, avoided eye contact, and paid protection just to survive. He had built a kingdom on humiliation and violence. But now, Bruno was gone. Dragged away in handcuffs like any other criminal. And for the first time in a long time, inmates realized something shocking. The prison boss was not a god. He was just a man. And the myth of his power had been shattered in one afternoon. Inside the prison, word spread like fire. Inmates kept repeating the same sentence in disbelief. Bruno bullied Steven Seagal, and didn't even know. The story moved fast from block to block. Even guards couldn't stop talking about it. Because it wasn't just about a fight. It was about a message. A message prison rarely hears. Control beats cruelty. Stephen returned to his cell block that day, walking with the same calm steps as before. But now, nobody laughed. Nobody bumped into him. Nobody mocked his cheap clothes. Men who used to enjoy bullying newcomers now moved out of the way as he passed. Not because Stephen threatened them, but because they had seen what real strength looked like. And they couldn't unsee it. The skinny inmate, his cellmate, watched Stephen sit down quietly on the bunk. He hesitated, then said, "Why didn't you destroy him?" Stephen looked up. "What do you mean?" he asked. The inmate's voice trembled with emotion. "You could have ended him. You could have humiliated him the same way he humiliated us." Stephen stayed silent for a moment. Then he replied with something that sounded simple, but carried a lifetime of discipline. "Because if I become him," Stephen said, "then he wins." The inmate froze. Stephen continued. "Bullies want to infect others with their behavior. They want the world to become like them. I refuse. That's what legends understand. Real power isn't proven by revenge. It's proven by control. Anybody can hurt someone. But not everybody can stop themselves from hurting someone." Later that week, something even bigger happened. Deputy Warden Harris gathered inmates in the yard and made an announcement. "Bruno Kane has been transferred," Harris said firmly. "He will face isolation and disciplinary action for years of violence and organizing assaults." The yard erupted, not in chaos, but in relief. Men who had been crushed under Bruno's rule finally felt air in their lungs again. Then Harris added, "This prison is changing." And the prisoners realized, the system finally saw what they endured. But the most unexpected moment came after the announcement. Harris walked up to Stephen privately near the fence. "You could have made this worse," Harris admitted. "You could have turned the yard into blood." Stephen nodded. "But I didn't come here to create fear." Harris stared at him. "Then what did you come here for?" Stephen's eyes held something deeper than anger, something almost spiritual. "To remind men, they still have a choice," Stephen answered. That same day, something quietly changed inside the prison. Some inmates approached Stephen with hesitant respect. Not Bruno's gang. Not predators. The weak ones. The forgotten ones. Men who had survived by staying invisible. One of them asked softly, "Can you teach us how you fight?" Stephen looked at them. Then he said, "I'll teach you more than fighting." And that's how it started. In the yard, during free time, Stephen began training inmates. Not to become violent, but to become disciplined. He taught stance, balance, breathing, focus. He taught them how to stay calm when emotions try to control you. He taught them that strength isn't in attacking first. It's in refusing to become a monster. Weeks passed, and slowly, the prison started to change. Fewer fights. Less bullying. More order. Because when one man stops feeding fear, others remember they can stop too. Outside the prison, rumors spread even further. Families heard it. Communities heard it. Even online pages started sharing versions of the story. Prison boss bullied a poor newcomer, not knowing he was Steven Seagal. The message went viral because people love instant regret stories. But what made this one powerful was something else. Stephen didn't win because he was famous. He won because he stayed calm. He won because he had discipline. He won because he refused to become cruel. And that's the real reason the story hit hearts. Because everybody knows a bully. And everybody wishes a bully would face consequences. But more importantly, everybody wants to believe that humility still defeats arrogance. Stephen sat in his cell one night and looked at the letters in his bag, the same letters Bruno had slapped onto the floor. He held them carefully, almost like they were sacred. Then he whispered something only he could hear. "They can lock the body, but they can't lock discipline. Never judge someone by appearance. Never bully the quiet person. Because silence doesn't always mean weakness. Sometimes it means strength under control." If you believe respect matters more than power, type respect in the comments. And tell me this. Should Stephen have forgiven Bruno, or punished him harder? Comment forgive or no mercy. Subscribe for more legendary fictional stories.